Good morning. Hope you guys are doing good. I know it's a little bit later than this email normally comes out. I apologize for that. I needed to go through, and I thought I needed to make this voice thread to help illustrate some of this information. It's simple, but me saying it to you is going to make it easier for you to understand than you just scrolling through this and reading it. Um, I have graded the week 7 assignments. There are some missing assignments. Check the email. If your name is in that email, you need to send me something. So get that stuff in. It's really, really important. This week, we're going to talk about programming basics. And then at the end of this PowerPoint, I'll talk a little bit about the assignment for this week. It's similar to what we've been doing, but it's using the material from this presentation. So programming equals periodization. Periodization just, it means it's a long-term approach. So what we're looking at here is not how to train for strength, hypertrophy, whatever, within a given single workout, because we know that already. We've talked about how we do our sets and reps and our rest periods and our weight, depending on our goal for a given workout. But now we're taking a much broader approach. How do we use those tools long term over the course of maybe an entire year or 2 years? So this is a pre-planned, systematic variation in training specificity. We're going to be manipulating those sets, those reps, the weight used, rest periods, all that stuff over a long period of time to achieve a given outcome. A little bit more about periodization. It's important for you to understand that for training to be truly effective and effective in a long-term model, it needs to be all sort of pre-planned in advance, and it needs to change. If we went into the weight room as a class and we did 3 sets of 10 on a bench press every day for the entire semester, we would get better at bench press for maybe a month, month and a half. But if we never increase the weight, if we never change our set and rep scheme, our body will become used to that exercise and we won't get any better. So we need to have variation. Now that variation can be, like I said, it can be the weight, it can be the reps, it can be how many sets, it can be the rest time, it can even be tweaking the exercise itself. Maybe instead of a bench press, we do a band resisted bench press or a chain bench press or a speed bench press or a dumbbell bench press. There's all these ways that we can vary a stimulus within a program where we're still training the same muscle groups and the same movement, but we're changing the stimulus enough that the body is forced to adapt. That's when real strength improvements occur. A lot of people love CrossFit. CrossFit is the most successful exercise brand there ever was. So they're doing something right, but what they don't do right is they don't take a long-term approach. So if you're an athlete and you go into your CrossFit gym and do whatever workout they have you do for that day, you will not get better over a long period of time. You will not get stronger after about a month of that training. It's good exercise, it's not good programming. So it's important to understand the difference between exercise, which is really just movement for the sake of movement, and true programming for a goal. They're very different. They look different. CrossFit is random. You're doing random things every day. There's really no rhyme or reason. A program, you're doing very specific exercises with specific manipulation of variables to get you where you want to go. A program needs to be progressive. Okay, that means that something's changing. Like we said, the weight or the reps or whatever, it needs to change or else you won't change. Going back to that bench press example. Training phases. Typically, we're going to break a program down into a year at a time. So I'm going to go use football as my example throughout this PowerPoint. That's something that I put a lot of time into training because that team works out year round. They're a perfect example of this. Some teams at the high school level don't, and they should. It's my opinion that every team should, but football does, and I've already got it written down. So we're going to talk about football as we go through this. So a year-long training cycle, it can't look the same the entire year. Hopefully by now we realize that most sports are going to require strength and power and hypertrophy and some level of endurance at some point or another. And we also know that we can't usually train for those things all at the same time. So what phases let us do is they let us break the year-long cycle up into different smaller programs to train for each one of those goals. So typical phases are an in-season phase. So that's when you're actually competing. So for football, that's the fall. Then there's postseason. Postseason is not like playoffs. It's after the championship game. It's the dead time. So for us, it's once our season ends through usually mid-December. That whole month of November, unless we're in the playoffs, we're not doing anything. Then you have the off season, which is like January through May. Then you have preseason, which is May through August. At least that's how we set it up. That kind of gives us the opportunity to train for different goals, introduce different movements during each phase. You don't need to know these words, they're just fancy ways of breaking down a year. So the off season phase, um, usually begins at the beginning of training up to about 10 to 12 weeks prior to the season. So a typical preseason phase is about 10 to 12 weeks. If you backtrack before that, you're doing your off-season work. Typically, it is the longest phase. It can be broken down into smaller portions. For instance, like I said, ours goes from January to May. We're not going to do the same workouts from January to May. Usually, there's 3 or 4 different phases within this phase for our football players. Um, During this time, you're doing a lot of resistance training. General movements, you're reteaching movements, you're laying the foundation to later go in and make it more complex. Maybe if we're talking about a bench press, how do we alter a bench press over time? You do a regular barbell press, then you add a band, then you add a chain, then you vary the weight, then maybe we do a dumbbell single arm, we add tempo. Those are all ways that we can change this over time, but we're going to start with a very general basic movement and just do a regular bench press during this phase. We'll also do some general speed and agility work if it's applicable. For football, it is, so we do some of that. Workouts are pretty long. There's no practices, there's no games, there's no film for the players. So all of their time and focus and energy is put into training so we can have longer workouts. Our typical goals are strength, power, hypertrophy, making sure body weighs where it needs to be, mastering general movements so we can become more advanced later, and then general flexibility and mobility. Preseason phase, like I said, about 10 to 12 weeks prior to the start of the season. Resistance training here now becomes much more sport specific. So we're getting away from our basic movements and we're trying to make these movements as athletic as we can get them. Things like the Olympic movements, deadlift, squat, those are multi-joint movements. They much more closely mimic on-field football movements than do dumbbell curls. So we're going to make all of our movements very specific. They're going to be very sport specific. They're going to train as much of the body as we can. This can also be broken down into smaller phases, typically 2 or 3. Our goals are maximum strength, maximum power, hypertrophy, and then mastering the specific sport movements we need for on-field play. The in-season phase, it's really a lot like the preseason phase, except it's shorter. We don't have as much time. Time here is extremely limited. The players are focusing on playing their sport. They have practice every day. They have film sessions. They have meetings. So the training, while just as important as anything else, doesn't get the same time that it got in the off season because we're splitting up these players' time. Conditioning is a huge aspect of this phase. We're not going to cover that because we're taking the approach of looking at the weight room, but it's a huge part of this phase. Usually that's done during practice. Workouts are very efficient. Maybe in the off season we're going to do 12 or 13 different exercises. In season we're going to do 6 to 8. So we're going to have very efficient movements, fewer movements. Reps are very low, intensities are very high because our goals are to maintain or gain upper and lower body strength, maintaining power, preventing on-field injury, and maintaining body weight. So it's like the preseason phase, but it's a lot shorter, more condensed, with higher percentages. Postseason phase, the length of this depends on the sport. It also depends on how far you went into the playoffs. If a team didn't make the playoffs, they're going to have a whole extra month compared to a team that went to the championship game for their postseason. There's really no formal training at this time. It gives players a chance to kind of relax, recharge, think about what they did right, what they did wrong. It's sort of a no contact period, but we do encourage athletes to still do some training on their own during this time. So an example yearly calendar. Again, I'm using football as my example. This is sort of what I create for each team before a training year. And I just kind of ran through this throughout the PowerPoint. You've got your off season, your preseason, your in season, your postseason. I, using our setup, our weight room, I know our coaches, I know how things work. I know that we should be getting this many lifts in during that time of the year. So we're 4 days a week all the way through July. In August, we'll drop to 3. In October, we're down to about 2. If we're happy or lucky enough to play in November, we're doing 2 a week. If we're playing in December, that means we're in the championship game. We would still be doing 2 a week, but right now we haven't done that in a long time, so it's 0. Speed and agility training, you don't need to do this as often as you do your resistance training. Again, speed, agility, conditioning, stuff like that isn't the main focus of this class, but I put it in here so you can see it. We're going to do it a couple days a week. This can change too, obviously. Like this past off season, we realized that we've got some decently quick players. We need to add size. Okay, so we took these out and put zeros in there, and we added that time each day into our lift to do longer lifts. So you can manipulate these, but speed, agility, conditioning, injury prevention in some form or fashion is most days, and then flexibility is worked into the workouts as well. Here's a sample bench press yearly cycle. So I just picked one exercise that we would do pretty much throughout the entire year and illustrated how we could change the reps and the intensity to achieve a particular goal. So this is kind of like what you guys have really been doing in your assignments. You've learned how to do this. So we've got this is for football, this is the way they would do it. Got your months, you got your phase. Here's your number of sets. Here's your number of reps. Here's the weight that you're using, and that's the goal you're training for. I don't usually make something like this for every exercise. It's just sort of it becomes automatic as I learn to program this. But for me to put this out, to type this out, it makes it really easy for you guys to see that in the off season, from January all the way down to May, all right, we're doing a lot more volume with our reps than we will be doing after. Sets of 15, 12, and 10, and 8, that's a lot of reps with pretty low intensity, 60 to 80. That's because we're going for hypertrophy. You can see how that changes. Hypertrophy, hypertrophy. Now we're kind of teetering between hypertrophy and strength for a few months. Now we're getting into maximal strength. We want to be as strong as we can. We're not messing with hypertrophy anymore. We don't have time for it. I don't want the players to be sore. So we've changed from being purely in the hypertrophy zone to sort of a hybrid zone down to purely in the strength zone. And the same thing would go for like our power training as well. But that's how we manipulate one exercise to hit these different goals at different points in the season. So here's your assignment. This presentation focused on training during different phases of the year. For your assignment, you need to write a 2-paragraph, not a 1, a 2-paragraph reflection on how training should be conducted during the in-season phase and the off-season phase. And I'm not asking for a program, just give me a little reflection showing that you understand sort of how to set up a program in the off-season versus the in-season. You want to answer these questions. How are the phases different? What should the sets and reps look like for each one? How heavy should the weight be for each one? Why do we have to program these so differently? And here's one that I did not cover in the PowerPoint, but I'm interested to hear what your opinion is. What would happen to the athletes if resistance training ceases in season? So let's say a team did their entire off-season and preseason phases, and then once the actual season came around, we just stopped lifting. What do we think would happen to them? There's obviously a lot of science to support the answer to this, but I don't need you to look it up. Just tell me what you think would happen, and then we'll kind of review it starting next week. So I hope that makes sense. I know this was longer than I wanted it to be at 14 minutes, but I think it's informative. I think it'll be an easy kind of jumpstart for you to do this presentation or this assignment. So email me with questions. I'm going to send this via email. I will attach this to the bulletin board on MyWJ. If you're missing an assignment, turn it in. Ask questions if they come up. Good luck with this, and I'll talk to you guys soon.